So I was brought up in the church. I say brought up in the church. I started to attend church when I was about 5 years old. We lived in San Antonio. My father was a long-haul cross-country truck driver. He was gone all the time. My mom's a trauma survivor. She lived in 14 foster homes and 2 state orphanages. So she needed Jesus too. So when we started going to church, we'd been going for like 3 years. And we had a rally, you know, special meetings and stuff. And during prayer requests, they asked for prayer. Because first night I was like, you know, pray for my dad. His truck don't roll over and blah, blah, blah. By the third night, I stood up and I said, when my dad's truck rolls over, please pray he don't die. And 4 days later, we got a call to pick him up at the airport because his truck rolled over. Yeah, and that's kind of where it all started. And I remember in the 70s, man, we could get our Jesus on. We knew how to love on Jesus. There was no two ways about it. And it was beautiful. And then when I got a little bit older, I started to recognize that it wasn't lining up. You know, the church didn't line up with the love that I was reading about. You know, there was lots of times I felt like I was just sitting on the pew all by myself because everybody else had all the answers for me. There was no empowerment. And it was because it was so based on punishment. You know, they'd treat you different if you did something wrong. Everything was focused on what you're doing wrong. You know, there was very little about compassion. And I remember one of the last times I went to church at my parents', because I'm a preacher's kid. I was like 24 when I showed up to church, and I'd started to grow some facial hair. I was pretty proud of that. I had a t-shirt on and I was going to go to church, and my father was like, you need to go home, shave, and put a shirt on. Well, I went home. I didn't go back. I tried going back a few times to church, but it was the same old stuff. You know, passive aggressive, people telling you what to do. It was hierarchy. It was patriarchal. You know, there was just things in it that were really triggering to me, especially being a person who had a little bit of trauma. My folks were so focused on church, they didn't pay attention to their children. I think that's a tragedy. So, angry? Yeah, that's an understatement. Angry at God, angry at everybody in the church, and wanted nothing to do with it. So I felt really hurt and lonely and isolated. I tried finding a way to make sense of the world. Some of the ways I did that were through drugs and alcohol. Yeah, and lots of times I had an attraction to risk. I'd put myself in incredibly dangerous situations. You know, if I weren't driving my motorcycle at 120 miles an hour, I was dropping all kinds of acid, and snorting enough coke to choke a horse, and many times would I end up throwing up because I was ODing, and I've laid on the bathroom floor praying to God to make it through because I was using heroin to get that warm hug that I needed on the inside. Because I couldn't get close to God and get that anymore. Not at that point. I was still too angry. It wasn't even an option. I was probably in my 30s when I decided I had to do something different. Church still weren't an option for me. So I went to counseling, and that was the beginning of it. That was the beginning of me seeking what wholeness might look like. And when being a person with a mental health diagnosis, substance use diagnosis, I was privy to some training on empathy. Didn't realize it was going to reconnect me to love. And then next thing you know, I'm doing all this studying on what love and compassion is and empathy. And then, you know, when my dad got sick, he had a triple bypass and a heart valve replacement. And so, none of my family could really get him to calm down. When he was at the hospital, he was pretty determined to go home that day, regardless of what anybody said. And my family knows that I listen in a different way with an open heart. So they asked me if I'd go down and see him. And I was like, sure, I'll go see Dad. Now, I gotta remind you, our relationship is a little strained, my dad and I. I come from a different place than he does. What I mean by that is, you know, he's really rigid in black and white thinking, and my thinking's not like that. My thinking's more about compassion and understanding and connection. But, I mean, this is the same guy that used to beat the hell out of me and say it was because God told him to. And so when I went down to see him, I had to really put aside my stuff, which thank God I'd done a bunch of work on it, or I'd have never been able to be with him. So when I got there, you know, he expressed the same thing he did to the rest of the family about how hard it was to stay there. And I validated him a little bit, and he calmed right down. And then he asked me to rub his feet. And I got to tell you, up until that point, if he'd asked me, I'd probably just walked away. But it was because I'd done some work around love that I was able to recognize that I was triggered. I was having a trauma response to him asking me to rub his feet, because he used to make me rub his feet as a kid. But this was an opportunity, and I kind of saw it that way. It was like God letting me know, look, this is an opportunity for you to move past that old story and into a new one where you can show him the love, God's love. So I sat there and I said I'd rub his feet, which I really just kind of held his ankles, and then I opened my heart and allowed God to move from my heart to his heart. I was actually picturing God's love moving from me to him. And the next thing you know, he passes right out. And then the nurse comes in and she goes, his blood pressure just went down 20 points. This is great. She goes, I don't know what you're doing, but please don't stop. And he wakes up and he goes, I don't know what he did to me, but man, I fell right to sleep. And it's like, yeah. That was the goodness of God. Yeah. So it was kind of cool, even though he's the minister. You know, they don't even see me as even being spiritual at all. But, you know, it just goes to show you what Jehovah Sneaky can do. So I was taking some training, and it was on nonviolent communication, which is compassion and empathy. That's what it's founded in. And the trainer asked me to make a statement to her that was hard for me to hear. And I said it with the same energy that people have said it to me with. And the whole place gasped. And then she got really good and grounded. And she goes, I wonder if it's because you want to contribute and you want to matter. Yep. It was like I was seen. I experienced love. I felt really moved. It was like I connected to what was in me. Really connecting to what was alive in me. It's like the Bible talks about being whole, be made whole. That's what saved means. It's not like one place or another. It's a journey of wholeness. And that was the beginning of my journey of wholeness, to what it meant to be human and connect to God's love inside me. And that was the first time I'd experienced it outside of church. And that's what reminded me of what God's love was. It's knowing who you are and being whole, realizing you have value. I mean, if God loves me, I'm worth loving. I'm worth loving myself. I think anytime I connect to what's moving me to feel what I'm feeling, I'm actually connecting to God's love. Every time I connect to the richness of God. Because it's given me a better relationship with this vessel that he's given me, and God lives in me. You don't have to look very far to find God, because he's in your heart. And that's what I was figuring out. God's been in my heart the whole time. I just had to work on my heart and opening it up. And I remember when Debbie asked me about going to church. And when I first got out of church, she says to me, she goes, why can't you be a normal sinner? And when she started going back to church, I was like, well, why can't you be a normal Christian? Go to church once a week, just the Sunday school, and that is it. I want to be going to church 5 times in a week. So about 3 months into this, you guys did the Reset conference. And you were a little short for help. And I remember Mary Fosno asking me if I could be a catcher. Well, yeah. So that was a bit of a shock. Growing up in the church that I grew up in, we had people that caught people, and there was tongue talking and all that, and healings and prophecy, but I'd been away for 30 years. So when she asked me about that, I was like, I don't know about that. I'll help out best I can. So we signed up, and then they were doing this prophetic thing downstairs where you'd go sit with 3 people and they'd do some prophecy. So I went out and saw Lise and asked if Deb was signed up for it. She said no. She goes, but we do have a slot available. And I was like, a deer in the headlights. And she goes, well, what's it gonna hurt? And of course, when she put it that way, I was like, well, probably nothing. So I went. So I get downstairs and all the tables are full, and I'm like, yes. Because they're like, well, all the tables are full, you'll have to wait. And I was looking at the door, and then as soon as I turned for the door, they're like, oh, one just opened up. It's Kay's table, Kay Wrigley. Well, I didn't realize what I was getting myself into. They all started talking, said something about a big project, and I was like, yeah, I've worked on a few big projects. I thought maybe they were kind of seeing what I had done. And she goes, yeah, and I see you on committee. And I was like, yeah, I've sat on a bunch of committees in my life. And she goes, BIW keeps coming up. She goes, it's a really big project. She goes, I see you with a clipboard, you're a supervisor, and you're doing a bunch of administrative stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not even looking for a job. So maybe this has something to do with volunteering at the church. I don't know what it is. So I kind of just put it on the back burner and don't think much more about it. Well, 4 months goes by, and I get headhunted by a local mental health agency. And they said, we need somebody to do some supervising. We want to start a new project. It's going to be really big. And here's your clipboard. And yeah, it was like, and we're going to need you to sit on a bunch of committees. And I was like, oh my God. It was like to the T of what Kay said. It still kind of surprises me today because it was so accurate. I mean, and I've told them all. I said, I'm here because God wants me here. And what's really cool is, in my job, I get to help people learn about compassion and empathy and what healthy friends really look like, that are in their own boundaries, have healthy boundaries. What does support look like? Because quite often the support I got, like at church 100 years ago, was do what we tell you, or they'd problem solve, they'd fix, one up, story tell, spiritualize, but there wasn't really being heard. And I get to bring that same love that I fell in love with and realized that was God, I get to bring to a mental health agency. This is awesome. Yeah, so it's like, and I had prayed about it for like 3 years. The last 3 years before I came to church, it was like, God, why do I have all this information? Why do I have this gift that could benefit so many people, and it can benefit the church an awful lot too? Because if those things had been in the church, I might have been in a different place. I might not have ever left the church.
Yeah, come on, man.
Right?
Troy, is God real?
Yes, God is definitely real.